Good morning, everybody. Today I am dealing with the topic on shock. What is shock? Shock is a condition in which the circulatory system is unable to provide adequate circulation to the vital body organs like brain, heart, and lungs as a result of decrease in the blood pressure. So the body is not able to supply adequate blood to the vital organs because of low blood pressure, that is shock. So it is a common final common pathway for a number of potentially lethal clinical events like severe hemorrhage, like extensive bleeding which happens, extensive trauma in cases of road traffic accidents, etc. Massive myocardial infarction, massive pulmonary embolism in which our heart is not able to maintain the blood pressure, and in cases of severe infection causing microbial sepsis, that is called septic shock. So regardless of the cause of shock, it leads to systemic hypoperfusion, that is reduced blood supply to the various organs in the body, and it is caused by decrease in the cardiac output or decrease in the effective circulating blood volume. So the end result of this will be hypotension, impaired tissue perfusion, and cellular hypoxia. So when there is reduced blood supply to the tissue, there will be reduced oxygen supply to the tissue causing hypoxia. So the classification of shock. So how the shock is classified? The shock is classified based on the cause of the shock, initial cause for the shock, like hypovolumic shock, cardiogenic shock, septic shock, anaphylactic shock, and neurogenic shock. So this is the major classification of shock. So, what is hypovolumic shock? Hypovolumic shock is because of the reduce in the circulating volume of the blood. This happens in cases of severe hemorrhage or fluid loss, as in cases of burns, dehydration, and in cases of trauma. So there is loss of blood or plasma volume. This leads to low cardiac output and causes shock. What happens in cardiogenic shock? Here, the blood volume or the fluid volume is normal, but there is the pumping capacity of the heart is reduced, as happens in cases of myocardial damage due to various causes that leads to myocardial pump failure, which causes reduced cardiac output. The cardiac output is not sufficient to maintain the blood pressure, and there is systemic hypoperfusion and leading to shock. This is the mechanism of cardiogenic shock. So this cardiogenic shock occurs in conditions like myocardial infarction, ventricular arrhythmias, or compression of the heart causing cardiac tamponade. So the other types of shock are septic shock. This occurs in systemic microbial infections wherein there is extensive infection in the body causing sepsis and leading to septic shock. Then the other type is the neurogenic shock, wherein there is loss of vascular tone. There is spinal injury or accidental anesthetic injury to the neural system that leads to loss of vascular tone that causes peripheral pooling of the blood. The blood does not return back to the heart, and that causes reduced cardiac output and systemic hypoperfusion. Next is the anaphylactic shock, which occurs in the type 1 hypersensitivity reaction, which is mediated by IgE, the immediate rapid hypersensitivity reaction. This causes systemic vasodilatation and increased vascular permeability. So what happens is when there is extensive vasodilatation, there is reduced blood pressure and causes hypotension and decreased tissue hypoperfusion. So this causes shock. This happens in severe allergic reactions, that is called anaphylactic shock. So what are the manifestations of shock? So there is total cardiovascular collapse. So because of that, there is increased pulse rate and decreased blood pressure. This is the classical signs of cardiovascular collapse. So once there is cardiovascular collapse, there is severe pallor because of reduced blood supply. There is pallor, that is whiteness, and the uh, body becomes cold and the skin becomes clammy. It becomes cold and clammy. Then there is very rapid pulse and the pulse is very feeble, that is thread-like pulse, rapid thread-like pulse. And when you monitor the blood pressure, it is very low. The BP is very low. And to compensate for the tissue oxygenation, the respiratory rate increases. So there is rapid respiration. And because the kidneys are not perfused, because of the low blood pressure, the urine is not formed and there is little or no urine passed. Then because the brain is also having hypoxia, low oxygen supply, there will be confusion. Later it may lead to coma and death if the cause for shock is not resolved. Now coming to the pathology of shock. Decreased cardiac output will lead to ineffective circulating blood volume. That will cause hypotension, systemic hypoperfusion, that is reduced blood supply to all the organs in the body, which leads to decreased oxygen supply, that is cellular hypoxia or total loss of oxygen supply, that is anoxia. This will lead initially to reversible cell injury, which is leads to anaerobic glycolysis and lactic acid accumulation. If not corrected, it will lead to irreversible cell injury and cell death. So if the shock is corrected at correct initial stages, it will revert back if the cell injury is at reversible stage. If it crosses the reversible stage, it will go to irreversible cell injury and cell death. So now coming to the aerobic metabolism, when there is adequate oxygen supply and adequate glucose supply to the the cell will undergo aerobic metabolism to generate energy. So once the oxygen and glucose supply is adequate, we through aerobic metabolism there is generation of energy, which is 36 ATP along with heat, water and carbon dioxide. If the oxygen supply and glucose supply is reduced, if there is no oxygen supply, it will lead to anaerobic metabolism, which will lead to accumulation of lactic acid. So what happens if there is anaerobic metabolism? One, it occurs in cases of inadequate cellular oxygenation, which leads to anaerobic metabolism. Anaerobic metabolism will produce less ATP and there is inadequate energy production and there will be metabolic failure. It can also cause lactic acid production, which will increase the lactic acid accumulation in the cells and cause cell death. So now pathogenesis of septic shock. What happens in septic shock is it is because of the severe infection by gram-negative bacilli, which produces endotoxin. Endotoxins are nothing but the bacterial wall lipopolysaccharides. toxic fatty acid complexes, and these are released when the bacteria are damaged during host response. These lipopolysaccharides, they bind to the lipopolysaccharide binding protein, and this complex gets attached to the cell surface receptor, which is CD14. This cause signal transducing protein called TLR4, that will be signals will be generated from this, and it causes many events like local inflammation, systemic effects, as well as in cases where there are high quantities, it will cause damage to the vital organs like heart and brain. So now coming to the stages of shock. There are three stages of shock, that is, initially it is a non-progressive stage, next is a progressive stage, and if uncorrected it goes to an irreversible stage leading to death of the patient. In non-progressive stage, there is low cardiac output when the reflex mechanisms gets activated, maintaining the perfusion to the vital organs. These compensatory mechanisms are by catecholamine release, renin-angiotensin axis, ADH hormone release, and baroreceptor reflexes. In the progressive stage, the tissue hypoperfusion is not compensated. There is worsening of the metabolic imbalances, like there is acidosis, then there is widespread tissue hypoxia, and the vital organs gets affected and begin to fail. The patient is confused because of reduced oxygen to the brain. There is reduced urine output, and next, if uncorrected at this stage, will go to the irreversible stage, and there is widespread cell injury, lysosomal enzymes leakage happens, that causes multi-organ failure and death of the patient. So I will complete today's topic here. The next class we will deal with the morphology of the shock.